Hello everybody, this is Fun Police and I am back with what is going to be the third and final video relating to the Company of Heroes 3 multiplayer pre-alpha. In the other two videos I took a look at the factions and pretty much showed off everything available within them, but this one is going to be my thoughts on what everything pretty much within the pre-alpha, what I liked, what I didn't like. The footage that is running in the background right now is just me recording some games against the AI. So you don't need to watch it. If you're not interested in that, you can just leave this on, almost like a podcast or just a commentary video in the background. And before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe. We won't see a lot of Company of Heroes 3 content in the meantime, but let me know in the comments below if you'd be interested in maybe some other Company of Heroes related content, such as games or talking about stuff in Company of Heroes 2. Anyway, let's just really get into it because there is definitely a lot to talk about and cover in this one video. So first off, let me talk about design. Design-wise, I generally like the direction they're heading in. I think a lot of the stuff is very cool and is set up in a way that, as long as it's tweaked correctly, is going to create a lot of interesting design space, and I think just could really, make Company of Heroes 3 such a cool game. To start off, visuals are the first thing. Obviously, because this is a pre-alpha, the visuals are not set in stone and are being improved on. We've even seen this between the two pre-alphas. It definitely seemed like the visuals took a at least somewhat noticeable upgrade, especially relating to like flames and other particle effects like that. But obviously, that is just a smaller thing. But I do overall like it. One of the best examples I can give is with tanks and deflecting rounds. I like that that is visually seen. I think that helps to add with the visual feedback of the game, which I think just overall helps to make it feel a bit better to play around with. Obviously needs more work, but I like the direction. Moving on from the visuals, we get more into the gameplay. And starting off, I really like that the Company of Heroes 1 resource points are back. I think it creates much more interesting maps, and overall just really is a superior system to that was done in Company of Heroes 2. Beyond that, we have Manpower Upkeep, and this is one of the, I think, the biggest problems within the game and its current main design or fundamental design. Manpower Upkeep for your units feels way too high at the moment. It seemed unrealistic to ever have an army that got above 60 or 70 pop cap, as anything above 100 or 60 pop cap pretty much gutted your manpower income to like 130 or so, or roughly around there, which is just way too low to do anything. The only way that you could really get around that was just only using armor, which is a problem that I hope does not persist in Company of Heroes 3, and I think that if it is becoming kind of the thing people are doing, it needs to be changed, because at least currently right now, Company of Heroes 3 has a really cool mechanic of combined arms play in the early to mid game, and the manpower upkeep stops you from getting a full army, but also I think really hurts combined arms play, because you just don't want infantry in the late game because they just take up too much manpower and they bleed, and you just need to save manpower to build more tanks. So I think that needs some serious look at. But otherwise, we move on to Infantry Combat. Overall, Infantry Combat was something that felt weird at first. All the combat in the game definitely felt off at first for me. But notably, I think the time to kill for units in cover felt weird. And it's a bit hard to explain. If you played it, I hope that, you can kind of understand where I'm coming from, in that it just felt like combat was a bit slow, especially if it was behind two green covers, and there wasn't much either side could really do to change that, because, at least to what I could tell, there was no way to really negate the cover. This also played into the height system, and talking about the height system really quickly, I really like the idea of height being essentially like a different form of cover, but it does seem like it is maybe a bit too strong at the moment. I don't know for certain, but it definitely seemed like cover, like height, would give pretty much negated cover for lower positioned or units that are in a lower elevation, which seems problematic because it means that, like, for example, a position on top of a hill, maybe behind a sandbag or other green cover, just felt really, really hard to push into. The only way to really do it was, like, you know, you either smoke the area, you have a vehicle to come dislodge the infantry, or you have, like, an indirect, like a mortar to do it. The effect of elevation, I think, is maybe a bit off. But circling back to infantry combat, cover definitely felt like it maybe what made the units too durable, because already units definitely felt like they are kind of tanky. And this did depend on the unit. In the open, two units shooting at each other felt good, but in cover, it just felt maybe a little too slow. On the other hand, the bigger problem I think that exists with infantry is that the animations for units when they start moving and when they're getting into cover seemed to essentially really mess with infantry, and it felt, I think, the infantry feel sluggish overall. Now, I do like the animations. Instead of the instant snapping that was in Company of Heroes 2, it feels a bit more realistic and a bit more like actually how an infantry unit would move. The problem I have is that stuff like units diving into cover stops them from shooting, and as such, that can change how units perform in combat. It's hard to say exactly, but it definitely felt noticeable when I'd run a squad up to shoot, you know, at an enemy point blank, and instead of shooting, they'd spend a second or two diving into cover with these fancy animations. I didn't like that, and I personally think that the animations are fine, but maybe they need to be sped up, or maybe the units can still shoot while they're doing it, or something just needs to change there, because it just feels a little bit off. Even after playing so much and even getting used to it, I still am not a fan of the animations and the unit infantry feeling a bit sluggish. Then moving on, we have armor. Armor combat, I'll say this up front, I absolutely hated armor combat at first. I really did not like it. It took me quite a while to warm up to it, especially after moving between Company of Heroes 2 and Company of Heroes 3. It felt a bit slow, it felt like deflections were too frequent, and this is more of a balance thing rather than a design feature, but I definitely did not like it at first, but I did warm up to it, and I like it more now. Notably, I think side armor is an amazing addition. Although at the moment, it seems to not be as important because things like medium tanks like the Sherman has, you know, pretty much the same frontal armor on the sides. So it feels less impactful than it probably should, and you know, but maybe after some changes, you know, to the balance of everything, it'll be more pronounced. But I definitely liked that coming back into the franchise. I think overall my biggest problem is that some of the armor values feel too high for various units. It feels like some vehicles will bounce too much, and as such it just feels a little bit problematic. And I think this is most notable with anti-tank guns, because of them being nerfed in being slower with slow setups. Even though they have a wider arc, anti-tank guns I think feel a lot weaker, which I will say as an aside that is a good thing. Anti-tank guns being stacked in Company of Heroes 2 is really problematic and difficult to deal with for armor. But when anti-tank guns then start bouncing all of their shots on units, it just feels like they're not worth it in, like, at all, essentially. And I think it's problematic because of that high armor value. So I hope that can be addressed in the future. But moving on, let's jump into the factions and what they offer. So the US, I'll come straight out, I absolutely love everything about the US. I love their tech structures, I love their the veterancy system, and I love the support centers. I think all of it is fantastic and really opens up the US to a ton of diversity, you know, just in its foundational core. You know, you may often start the game with one or two, like, build orders, but the game but the US feels like it blossoms out into just so many different options. You know, from the massive, like what structures are you teching to carry you in the mid to late game, to something like which support center you're picking, which is another massive decision, you know, because of what you're going to focus on in the in your army, whether it's infantry, maybe some extra air power or whatever else, you know, to even something smaller like the veterancy, which doesn't fundamentally change most units, but instead offers a really unique system where you are able to slightly change how a unit performs. For example, the rifleman's veterancy abilities are really cool. One of them, cover to cover, allows the rifleman to sprint, which allows them to be very aggressive, getting up close to enemy units or sprinting past machine gun arcs. On the other hand, pour it on them acts more like a defensive tool. Because it can suppress, it allows the rifleman squad to zone out enemy units like Panzer Grenadiers that would otherwise love to run up to the riflemen and just shred them. And I think that's a really cool system. It really helps to make everything feel just very diverse, and I really like it overall. The Wehrmacht, on the other hand, I also really enjoy their tech system. The fact that you have a split option between one of two tier 2s, which then also has more splits, it definitely feels not as maybe open as the US in the smaller decisions, but in the big tech decisions, I think it does have even potentially a bigger impact, because teching up from one of the tier 2s into your more mid to late game units is a big decision, and it can really change how you tackle the game. Field Marshals are the other element of the Wehrmacht, but I do have some issues with them. Most notably, I think the biggest problem is that they are lacking in their decision making. You have to kind of pick one early in the game, and essentially the biggest thing they do is they give your grenadiers a specific grenade, and then they tell what veterancy all your units are going to have, alongside a few other different things. Now, this isn't inherently a bad system, but I think it's also being underutilized. The Wehrmacht as a faction overall doesn't have a lot of side tech options. The only one it really has is essentially getting medics in the HQ base, and also the advanced assault tactics, which is essentially kind of like a pseudo tier 3 for them. You know, but otherwise, they don't have any side techs. Meanwhile, the US has a ton of them. You know, riflemen have their thing. You have the side techs of the rifleman upgrades. You have your medical camp. You have the support centers, which is like 4 side techs. You know, you potentially have side techs into the motor pool for them. There's a lot of options. The Wehrmacht, on the other hand, feels a little bit less in that category. And I'm not saying both need to be as complex as the US, but it definitely feels like if there was maybe a slight, at least one option to maybe invest into, I think that would be an interesting idea. And the Field Marshal seems like it's a good system to do that. You should still be able to probably pick that starting unit, but maybe then you could upgrade the Field Marshal, promote them maybe, and that would give you some extra benefits. As an idea, you know, like the Fortification Commander back in the first pre-alpha would make your Pioneer squads into 4 men. That could be an interesting thing if you do a side tech to promote your Field Marshal. You get a bigger Pioneer squad, which maybe, you know, changes how you deal with the early game. Or maybe, you know, it can alter units late game, you know, and the last tier of units, each Field Marshal slightly changes one of those units. Just random ideas off the top of my head. But I definitely just hope that the Field Marshal system has a little bit more added on to it. It just feels like a kind of wasted opportunity at the moment. Then we move on to the third thing, and the kind of biggest thing for Company of Heroes in terms of diversifying builds, and that's battle groups. Battle groups I really like, combining the elements of Company of Heroes 1 with elements of the Company of Heroes 2 system. I think it strikes a very good middle, and I think it's probably the best system in all the Company of Heroes games that I've seen officially. I have seen I think there's certain mods that have done even better systems, but those are more complicated, and I think Battlegroup strikes that happy middle ground between the two official systems. However, there are some, I think, problems within them. Notably, I think the passives are in the game, in some of them, are not good. Namely, stuff like just passive cost reductions for units just doesn't feel right, in my opinion. I'm not personally a fan of those. And on the other hand, I also am wary of the call-ins being techless. That seems like it potentially has a lot of problems with their timings and overall the power level of them, and it might cause a lot of balance problems. And kind of adding on to that, I want to talk about with having two airborne companies or battle groups at our disposal, we got a lot of time to test out airstrikes. And overall, I gotta say that they just feel really bad at the moment. Airstrikes are just way too slow to come in, and it just feels like such a waste of munitions. That's one thing I think that needs to change, is airstrikes need to come in faster. Or, if you wanted to keep this slow speed, they maybe don't need those red flares that tells the enemy where they're coming. And the enemy has to just be prepared for them. But it definitely feels like it's way too easy to dodge them. I can't remember a single time where I used an airstrike and thought, oh yeah, that was a good use of munitions. They feel really bad right now. And then the other thing I want to talk about that's related to battle groups are the call-ins. I've already talked about how their imbalance might be a little bit off, but one of the things I don't like is that there are call-ins that have groups of units together. Like, for example, the Easy 8 Task Force is an Easy 8 Sherman alongside a basic rifleman squad. And I do not like that system in relation to it being pretty much only basic units. I do like the idea of dual unit call-ins, where they contain maybe 2 or 3 units. I think that is a cool idea, and I don't want to see that removed personally, but I think that when you combine these call-ins with just otherwise basic units, it really detracts from various elements. Namely, the Easy 8 Task Force, I think, is the best example. You often want the Easy 8 as it's arguably the best U.S. armored unit, at least at the moment in the late game. But on the other hand, that basic rifleman squad is driving up the manpower price of the call-in for no reason. Late game, a unvetted rifleman squad is just something you really don't want, especially in large numbers, which every time you want an Easy 8, you got to get a rifleman squad. And as such, I think that there needs to be one big change, and that is that for call-ins like the Easy 8 Task Force, the Rifleman Squad and other units that are maybe a bit lackluster need to be made unique. Now, how you do this could vary, but I've had various ideas. Stuff like you could name the infantry unit after like a division that fought in the Italian campaign. Like let's say, I forget it. But let's say the 1st Armored Division for the U.S. fought within Italy. Okay, you could name the Easy 8 Task Force Riflemen a 1st Armored Division Rifleman. And then you give them unique traits, They could get special attributes that make them uniquely powerful compared to their brethren. Maybe they arrive pre-equipped with 2 bars, and the special benefit from them is that they have both veterancy abilities. This could make them really unique and make it really worthwhile to get this call-in, because it's a way to essentially get a slightly better version of otherwise plain infantry. And you could extend that out to all the other call-ins. For example, the Luftwaffe Combat Group that contains a Wirbelwind and a Jaeger. Maybe the Jaeger squad arrives with its scoped G43 and a Panzer, making it more of an all-rounder squad, able to tackle enemy infantry and also being able to threaten vehicles. And ideas similar to that. With that all out of the way, let's talk more about the balance, though. So starting out, I'm just going to run through the units that I saw some balance issues with. I'm not going to tackle every single unit. That would, I think, drag the video out a little too long. And this video is already going to run a bit longer than I want. So let's just go right into it. So for the U.S., Riflemen feel fantastic. I really like that they scale so well. You know, they definitely feel powerful, even in the late game, even against Axis infantry, as long as you've teched them up and they got some veterancy under their belt. However, one notable problem is that riflemen and grenadiers seemingly match up a bit too much in the early game. And this is a slightly bigger problem with infantry combat and time to kill, I think, being off, but that I talked about previously. But most notably, it feels like their riflemen and grenadiers are essentially the same unit early on, and it's kind of just down to RNG who wins. It doesn't feel like the riflemen are significantly advantaged at close range, nor are grenadiers specifically advantaged at long range, which I think is a bit of a shame, as, you know, it just doesn't take away a lot of interesting things. It's like whoever gets into cover first, or maybe whoever gets a lucky kill on a model before the other one, or who can bring more infantry units to bear. It just overall, I think, needs some adjustment. I think riflemen need better close-range DPS, you know, pre-bar. You know, even if you have to maybe nerf the bar's damage as a, you know, to balance it out late game. But early on, I think they need to be, you know, a little bit more dominating at close range to, you know, give them a bit more of an interesting dynamic. Next up is the Jeep. The Jeep is a unit that I think scales way too well into the late game for what is essentially an ultralight vehicle. It is namely able to become an incredibly powerful support unit. Being able to become having self-repair makes it very easy to not get a repair unit or an engineer unit out to repair it, saving you a lot of manpower. You're able to upgrade it as a command vehicle, essentially allowing it to buff nearby infantry units, and it can even become a weapon platform, deploying mortars and machine guns as you need them. Although for a moderate expensive, or a somewhat expensive munition cost, it's still just a lot. And I think that they need to maybe lose one of these abilities, you know, maybe like the command upgrade, just because it just feels like they're doing it does way too much past the early game. And I'm not opposed to vehicles having, you know, a vehicle like the Jeep not being made obsolete after the first 3 minutes of the game, but it definitely feels like the Jeep becomes like just so much, you know, with just like an upgrade and after it gets veterancy 1, that I think it needs to maybe just get toned back a little bit. Next up is the Bazooka Squad. The Bazooka Squad, I really like that handheld AT threatens enemy armor even in late game. Side armor definitely helps a lot like that with this, and I like that the Bazooka team, although not able to frontally threaten something like a Panzer IV, if they come around the side, is just really able to scare them away, because they also have a snare alongside the ability to follow up that snare with almost a guaranteed kill. It's a very cool unit, and I'm very happy to see this instead of the Company of Heroes 2 system, where bazookas were kind of something you got on your support units, and they offered a very small benefit against armor overall. The M3 half-track is one unit that I have some concerns about. It comes out potentially very early with specific builds, as cheap as your first 40 fuel, and granted you start with, I believe, if my memory serves, 30, so you only need about 10 fuel before you're able to put an M3 half-track on the field. And because of half-tracks and their current systems of being able to reinforce squads and healing them and doing a variety of things, the half-track hits very hard very early, and can quickly snowball an advantage, acting as a forward healing and reinforcement point. And I have some concerns over that. Now, I don't know exactly, you know, if this is fixable by just nerfing the units that it's causing a problem with. I'll just say right now it's the assault engineers that are really causing, I think, problems with the M3, and maybe that's just a problem on the assault engineers. But the half-track, I definitely think, is a massive force multiplier in this early game phase, and it's very, very powerful. Maybe it needs to be a little more expensive, maybe it needs to be a bit weaker in its combat potential, maybe it needs some sort of tech restriction, I don't know, but it just feels a little too good at its timing, which then also scales because you can then get, for example, an anti-air, the quad mount, which makes it very good at just bleeding infantry heavily. So, I don't know, it just feels overall kind of too good at the moment, in my opinion. Then before we get into the higher tiers, let's just talk quickly about the support centers again. Balance-wise, the Armor and Infantry Support Center are pretty good. They are really good in their effects. I think the infantry has the advantage because it gives better manpower economy, which is like a big limiting factor. But both of them have their uses. Although I will say that them having 3 abilities that are munition sinks feels wrong. These things are, you essentially get like just so much like in their options for, you know, seemingly what is already a pretty loaded ability. You get like some immediate benefit like a captain squad or a repair bay. You can get those extra upgrades, but then they also allow you to be like big munition sinks. It takes away, I think, from battle groups and hurts the third support center quite a lot of the air support center. Namely, the Air Support Center doesn't offer any other benefit outside of the 3 airstrikes and ways to improve those airstrikes. And I think that is problematic overall in terms of making that Air Support Center just not feel very useful. I do think that there should be a passive effect for the Air Support Center. I think, for example, maybe it could provide a small amount of permanent munition income to slightly boost it up, you know, maybe like +5 munitions just permanently added to your income, so it's a bit easier to afford these airstrikes if you go for it. You know, that would also make it useful for getting like extra upgrades on your units or using abilities a little bit more, and I think it would definitely help the Air Support Center. But I definitely think that the other 2 support centers could just lose their munition sinks, or maybe they should only get 1 ability like this. I think they're just overall a bit too... It's doing a bit too much and is taking away from other elements of the game. Moving on, let's talk about Tier 3. So the AT gun I talked about a little bit a while ago in the design process, that namely AT guns have been nerfed and they're a lot slower and a lot clunkier to use. And I don't think that is a bad thing, but I feel like the lower penetration of the mainly the American AT gun is problematic because of that. Paying what is essentially almost 300 manpower for a slow team weapon that is only effective against vehicles, only to have vehicles, you know, just kind of circle around it without ever hoping to deal any damage to them, you know, while also just very often just bouncing off the front of like the Germans, you know, primary medium tank is just not a good feeling. And I definitely think that they should remain slow and more of a support option, but that they should have their penetration increased or the armor of the Axis vehicles gets lowered in order to just be more effective. And this also shares a little bit with the Panzer, with the Pak 40, which I feel a similar way. Although it seems to have maybe a little bit higher penetration, or maybe it's because the U.S. armor is a bit lower, but that feels a little bit better. The other vehicle I want to just mention real quick is the Chaffee. I absolutely love the Chaffee. At first, I thought it was going to essentially just be like the Puma of OKW just in the US, you know, essentially a vehicle you get out in the early to mid game and it absolutely just destroys the hell out of like any other light vehicle in the game. But then as soon as a medium tank rolls out, the Chaffee's gone, you know, it's non-existent. To my surprise, the Chaffee holds its own, especially because of its high speed and its ability and the addition of side armor. The Chaffee felt like it could actually be used as a late game unit. You know, you could use a couple Chafees and swarm an enemy tank, getting side penetrations and actually being able to tackle bigger threatening units. And I actually really like that. I don't have a lot balance-wise with the Chaffee. I just wanted to comment how I really liked that it was a good unit that actually retained usefulness past like the mid-game. The M18 Hellcat is the next one I wanted to talk about. This one definitely seems too weak. The Hellcat is very, very vulnerable with very low health and suffers from the same range as every other tanks. Because of seemingly the idea that you're supposed to dive with the M18 Hellcat due to it having inherent flanking speed, I think it needs to have some more health added on so it can survive a bit more damage and overall make sure to get to the side. I think it should also get a speed increase, as it is very difficult, it felt like, to get on the sides of tanks because most tanks move at the same speed and are pretty fast. So I think that overall the Chaffee, or the M18 Hellcat, needs some buffs to it, but once it does, it should hopefully be a more solid late-game AT source for the US. Then let's talk about Doctrines. So overall, Airborne is the less problematic of the two, and I would say is probably even a little bit underpowered. The problems with airstrikes that I talked about previously are very front and center because so much of this doctrine is related to that. And on the other side, the units that are called in vary in their quality. Pathfinders are actually really, really good, they seem like. Very cheap and very powerful and competent in combat. They allow for the very aggressive like M3 half-track that I was talking about being problematic. And they also allow for team weapons. On the other hand, it also feels like paratroopers are really weak at the moment. They are expensive units, but then are pretty much ineffective until they get their M1919s, and without them they just aren't impressive. The double bazooka upgrade just felt awful to get, and after I got it like once or twice, I never touched it again because it just felt so bad compared to just getting like a bazooka team, you know, who just has a snare alongside their bazookas, you know, and I could keep my elite infantry as actual combat units. I think overall, paratroopers need their bazooka package to be more powerful. Maybe they could carry around 3 bazookas. That might make them a bit more threatening. You know, they're able to really mess up, you know, a tank if they get on the flank of it. And the M1919s, I think they're overall, maybe the M1919s could be nerfed a little bit, but the overall basic performance of a paratrooper squad is more effective, or maybe they're just more durable. I don't know, but they definitely feel like they need a buff. And then the airdropped weapons are probably the last thing to talk about. They're fine. They allow you to skip certain techs. Like, for example, the AT gun airdrop allows you to skip ever building tier 3, really, as if you don't go for a Greyhound or a Chaffee in the mid-game, you probably are just going for like a Sherman medium tank, and you can then back it up with an AT gun without having to back tech with a kind of expensive building. The bigger problem, though, was the armored battle group. The armored battle group definitely, I think, is way too strong at the moment. The one thing that instantly breaks it are assault engineers. With being able to turn your 200 manpower combat engineer into a fully fledged close range combat unit is just way too strong. It's extremely easy to spam them out in mass, and they just dominate grenadiers. There's just not a whole lot you can do without like having either an MG and luring them into it, or potentially having multiple grenadiers to focus that fire them down. But it's very difficult to go a numbers game because of the fact that you just have like a 200 manpower squads you have to keep up with. And this isn't helped at all by the fact that the M3 half-track is there providing fire support and also replacing any losses they take running up to you. And it's overall very oppressive. So I think assault engineers definitely need their cost increased. They need to go to like 260, 270 manpower, or pretty much the same as like riflemen and grenadiers, because they are just actual like serious combat units, and it's not good that they are so cheap. But the rest of the battle group is also kind of problematic. Talking on the left side, there's a lot of passive economic stuff, which I talked about previously. I wasn't a fan of a lot of passive stuff, so overall I didn't like that. And I also didn't like the M31 recovery vehicle. There's a lot of complaints about it already online, and I generally tend to agree. I think it could work, but it definitely needs to pay significantly more fuel to recover vehicles. And I think, namely, it should maybe only be able to recover something like a Sherman wreck or something like that, and then maybe it goes on an extremely long cooldown or something like that, but it just definitely felt kind of problematic. Otherwise, there is the Easy 8 Task Force, which I talked about earlier. I think the Rifleman Squad really drags it down, but the Easy 8 itself also feels like it lacks as much punch as it maybe should have. It seemed to be almost the exact same speed as a Sherman, even though I think it probably should be a little bit faster. But I think the bigger problem is indeed that the 76mm gun feels a bit weaker than it maybe should compared to the 75 of the normal Sherman. But yeah, overall, I think definitely the battle groups, the airborne battle group needs some buffs, and maybe a tiny nerf to Pathfinders, and then pretty much everything I think in armored battle groups needs a nerf. That battle group's pretty overtuned, in my opinion. Moving on to the second faction of the Wehrmacht, however, we can start off with the Grenadiers, which is the same complaint I have with the Riflemen. I feel like Grenadiers need a buff to their long-range performance, but a nerf to their close-range performance. So there's a bit more diversity in their starting combat with Riflemen. But overall, otherwise, I really like what Grenadiers bring to the table. Their planned obsolescence is, I think, a cool idea. However, transfer orders, I think, also need a little bit of a change. It's very hard to justify transferring Grenadiers after they start getting Veterancy 1 and Veterancy 2 because they retain none of it. And it overall, I think, hurts the mechanic of trying to transition your infantry into, the more powerful variants. And I think overall, the Grenadiers, the transfer orders should retain some small portion of it, maybe like a third of the experience. That way, for example, a 3-star Grenadier turns into a 1-star Jaeger infantry or a Panzer Grenadier. Just something so it's a little bit easier to justify with more veterancy Grenadiers. At the moment, it just feels very restricted to as soon as you build the tech building, you transfer one of your Grenadiers over, and then that's the only time you use it, really. The Kettenkrad is the second thing, though. It's hard to say my exact thoughts on it, but it feels almost impossible to skip because of its excellent capping ability. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing, I'm not going to really comment on, but it does feel very difficult to skip it, which might be a good or bad thing depending on who you ask. But let's get into the bigger thing of the split teching in Tier 2, the Luftwaffe Company and the Panzer Grenadier Company. So the Panzer Grenadier Company, starting off, is fantastic. It's very, very strong. And seems to be seemed like the de facto option. You get Panzer Grenadiers, which are excellent close range, which work well with Grenadiers, who seemingly should be a more long range squad. You got access to an anti-tank gun, which is very useful. The Pak-40 seemingly works better because it has either more penetration, or maybe it's just because the US vehicles have less armor, but it felt like it was a more useful tool. And then you get the half-track of your own, which allows you to be more aggressive combined with the Panzer Grenadiers, which is very nice, alongside a forward reinforcement point. You could even convert it into a light set of artillery. And then after the advanced assault tactics, you got a Nebelwerfer, which was a rocket artillery, very useful late game for fighting against well-placed enemies and team weapons. And then you also got the Stug 3, which is just like a really, really good vehicle. Being able to, obviously threaten enemy armor. It has good armor itself. It's quite durable. It can get an MG pintle to offer some anti-infantry, and it can even load HE rounds. And I like all of this, but it definitely feels like for its cost, it does a lot. And I think that, and I'll talk about what I think maybe should be done with it after we talk about the other tier, the Luftwaffe Company. The Luftwaffe Company is, I think, overall too weak. The biggest problems is that, unlike Panzergren, it doesn't have as good of scaling into the late game, and has some problems with its AT. The Jaeger infantry are not as strong as Panzer Grenadiers, namely because they require a 60 munition upgrade to get their best form, with the scoped G43. And without it, they just didn't feel as powerful compared to Panzer Grenadiers, who would come down and pretty much immediately feel like a powerhouse. So there's a much higher munition cost in that. On top of that, the 90 munition Panzerschreck is just really, really expensive for what is seemingly the primary AT of this faction, of this specific tier. And I think that definitely the Panzerschreck needs to go down in cost. Maybe 60 or maybe 70 munitions I think would be a lot easier to afford and use on squads of Jaegers. Because outside of that AT, we're going to talk about why that's like the most consistent. The 221 was a very good shock vehicle. Very good at shocking and attacking infantry when it initially comes out. However, its AT upgrade sucks. It's just absolute garbage. It just does so little. You don't have any turret rotation, so it becomes like a turret or a tank destroyer that can't spin, and the penetration is low and the damage is pitiful. This definitely needs more buffs to it. It just needs to be better at actually threatening enemy armor, at least light enemy armor up to something like the Chaffee. Without that, like, this 221 just doesn't feel like this upgrade is ever worth getting, and it really hurts because that means you have no armored source of AT until you get into your advanced assault tactics, which is a problem because you don't have something like the Pak 40 to make up for that until then. The Flak 30, I think, is a really cool weapon. I like the model of it. I like its lethality, although it does kind of feel like just a bigger MG, so, there's a little bit of parallels there, but maybe it could use a small penetration buff to better scare away vehicles, or maybe it could do a little bit more damage just to kind of better scare away vehicles from shooting at it, and it can act a little bit more like an AT gun against lighter vehicles. Then in their advanced assault tactics, the Whirlwind is great AI, but it's very expensive. It's difficult to get this because anything with a tank cannon will really bully it around, and you don't have something like AT guns to scare them away. If there was better AT elsewhere, I think the Whirlwind is fine. The Martyr, on the other hand, I think is in a very weird space. It is relatively cheap, a little bit cheaper than the Stug actually, but has higher range and high damage, but is also very fragile with low frontal armor and low health. And I think overall, the Martyr is just not nearly as good as the Stug in terms of its capabilities. The Martyr just doesn't have that. It doesn't have any anti-infantry capabilities, so it's only for anti-tanks, and it's not even that much cheaper than something like the Stug. The Stug is just significantly better. And I think that the Martyr needs to have its cost reduced. It needs to be a little bit cheaper, I think, in order to make it maybe not spammable, but easier to employ in numbers of 2 to 3 in order to, make it easier to actually afford losing Martyrs, because they don't have any ways to defend themselves against infantry. So it should be a little bit easier to, bully them around with like a Bazooka Squad if they're being spammed too much. Then moving on, we have the Tier 4 units, which are the Strasstruppen, and the Strasstruppen overall felt weak on the end. Compared to other units, they didn't feel particularly stronger. Of course, if they were in green cover, they absolutely wrecked riflemen, but they didn't feel like shock troops to me, at least. They didn't have anything that really made them stand out, and usually I ended up getting one of them because they were nice to have, but mainly they just seemed like a mid-range combat squad at best, and that was about it with them. I had an idea of what if Field Marshals changed what loadout the Strasstruppen would have. So, for example, maybe they would get one unique weapon based on the commander you pick. So the mechanized one maybe gets access to a flamethrower and is more aggressive, being able to maybe pop out of vehicles and, use that flamethrower. While, for example, the fortification Strasstruppen get access to an LMG-42 and are the current variations. And then the Special Operation Field Marshal maybe gives them a Panzer Schreck or something like that, or a Panzer Faust. And, they all vary in their upgrades. It could be something, a little bit of an interesting way, and also segues very well into talking about Field Marshals again, which, as I talked about earlier, I felt like needed some better late game things. Mechanized definitely felt like the best of the commanders because the extra armor and whatnot that he gave was definitely, I felt like, the most impactful. The fortifications one worked also and had some really funny cheese stuff, namely because you could just haul down in combat instantly. That's I'm 99% sure is not intended. So once that changes, it probably gets weaker. And Special Ops had a few unique things, but also just didn't bring as much to the table, I thought, overall. And as such, I do think they all need a little bit of balance. But as I said also earlier, I feel like they need more unique things. The Strasstruppen maybe could get unique upgrades from each of them, but also stuff like fortifications giving 4-man pioneers. Maybe they could all edit units besides grenadiers. Maybe they could all edit 2 units in like the barrack, in like the HQ or the barracks, or maybe later in the game. Mechanized maybe could upgrade the Kettenkrad and the Panzer IV. Fortification could upgrade maybe the Brumbar and the Pioneers, and then Special Ops maybe could upgrade, like the Sniper or maybe the Grenadiers themselves somehow, and then they upgrade the Strasstruppen later on. And that's just an idea. But, I just feel like the Field Marshals overall need to be a bit more interesting than what veterancy you want for your units throughout the game, which is cool, but, I feel like there should be a tech upgrade that maybe, could replace, various units with superior versions if you pick that commander, allowing them to specialize your army a bit more. Beyond that, we're going to talk about the battle groups. To finish this video up. So the Fallschirmjäger or Luftwaffe battle group, I overall liked it. Fallschirm Pioneers were, I think, fantastic. Fallschirmjäger, on the other hand, felt like they lacked a niche. There's already a lot of powerful elite infantry, and the biggest claim to fame I found for the Fallschirmjägers were that they were essentially Panzer Grenadiers that were stronger at range, and that they had a Faust on them. So maybe there is a niche there, and we just didn't have time to really figure it out, but it felt like they kind of lacked a reason, depending on your picks, on what they could do. The Flak 88 also felt lackluster, because they definitely have a low manpower cost, which I actually liked. But they also had a really high manpower cost to compensate, and I don't know if I actually preferred that. 420 manpower for them is a lot, and even though it's only 20 fuel, it's just, maybe they could be a little more expensive fuel wise, or maybe they could even cost some munitions, but I feel like 420 manpower is just a lot. That's about the same as an actual tank, so I don't know, it felt difficult to justify. Which also didn't help because they're very weak to indirect fire, and because of stuff like mortars and other indirects being really powerful and really useful, the 88 just didn't see much use from what I got out of it for its cost. On the other side, the air-based abilities were, again, problematic. The airstrikes kind of sucked. The passive infantry reinforcement cost, I didn't like either. The fact that you just kind of got, like a flat reduction on all your infantry things, I'm not a fan of the passives, and I'd prefer this maybe be a timed ability, or maybe it only works on certain units, or I don't know, I just didn't like it. And then the final thing is that the Fallschirmjäger reinforcement paradrop ability was a little bit silly in its implementation. And that is because you were able to essentially just brute force combat with it, because units could continually reinforce in that area for the entire ability duration, and it allowed them to kind of just go into battle, start taking casualties, and instantly be reinforcing throughout combat. And that just felt like very cheesy. It was definitely the biggest benefit of the Fallschirmjägers was that you could essentially like jam two of them into combat and then just keep reinforcing them, and the enemy couldn't wipe them fast enough in order to actually force you to retreat, and it just felt, off. But overall, the Liftoff Commander, I think, or Battle Group, I think, was overall a little weak, and it just needs some buffs, but definitely there are maybe one or two things to look at balance-wise. On the other hand, similar to how the Armored Battle Group for the US was too strong, I feel like the Mechanized Breakthrough Battle Group for the Germans were too strong. Assault Grenadiers, starting it off, were very silly. For a mere 25 munitions, you turn Grenadiers into actual capable combat squads. I'm going to associate it again with the power of Assault Engineers from the Armored Battle Group. It just felt way too cheap for the amount of power you got out of it, and I just think it needs to be a little more expensive to make it harder to acquire on your various infantry units, or maybe it could be locked behind tech so it appears a little later into the game. You also had the Panzer IV Command Tank, which was very, very powerful. In fact, probably a little bit, I would say definitely a good amount too powerful. It comes in very quickly for a relatively low cost. It doesn't require any real teching, meaning that it has a very aggressive timing, and it has just a lot going for it. It has the ability to load HE shells for free, which allows it to become very good at killing infantry. Its penetration is very capable against most early vehicles, and even if they're not able to penetrate for whatever reason because they're missing or whatever, the Panzer IV itself is just well armored, very well armored in fact, and that it's very difficult to kill early on. On top of that, add on a Commandor, which is supposed to be buffing nearby infantry, and you have a unit that is very, very powerful and I think hits a little too hard in its timing. And then the Tiger is the final big bad unit of the Doctrine, our battle group, and it is just needing some nerfs. It's got more range than enemy vehicles, it's got more armor, more health, its gun does more damage. It just has more of everything, which makes sense because it is a heavy tank and it's meant to be a very powerful unit. But I definitely feel like maybe it could lose that extra range, or it needs to lose maybe that extra damage on it. But I think the extra range is probably the biggest thing that it should lose. The fact that it's outzoning things like Hellcats and whatnot just feels wrong in my opinion. On the other side, you have a lot of economic-based stuff and some activated abilities. I'm overall fine with the activated stuff and not a fan of the passives. Not a lot changes. The Strasstruppen call-in does have its uses. I definitely like that you could get a Strasstruppen extra early. And maybe this is a call-in that you can make work, but I did dislike that it is a call-in that you essentially only get in very specific timings and then never touch again. And maybe, similar to other call-ins, the Strasstruppen call-in needs to have a special unit, like a special Strasstruppen, or maybe the half-track itself could be a unique variation. Maybe it's able to upgrade with a special thing like a flamethrower attachment, similar to the Company of Heroes 2 half-track, and that's something maybe unique to this battle group and this specific call-in, I don't know, something like that. But outside of that, I've just essentially covered everything I've wanted to talk about. As expected, this video dragged on for quite a while. I'm gonna leave the video running to finish up this last match that we're watching. But otherwise, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of the Company of Heroes 3 pre-alpha. Were there any balance concerns that you didn't like or loved, or just any thoughts on the game, period? I'm interested to hear what the community thinks. Otherwise, again, make sure to like and subscribe, help the channel grow. I definitely appreciate everybody that does that. And also, if you're down in the comments, remember to let me know if you want to see more Company of Heroes stuff. I'm definitely going to keep doing stuff as Company of Hero betas come out. Company of Hero 3 betas, I should say. But I could also do stuff in Company of Heroes 2 and various other things if people are interested in that. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching and have a good day.
We can do either. Pioneers have building orders.
The men are ready. We're on the move. Follow me. Order near advancing to the line. That's what you need.
Sure, I keep count of kills. Bullets changing barrels.
Territory point is ours. Despite our best efforts, huh?
Awaiting. Get us moving. Enemy point at 300. We are ready and waiting. Pioneers have building orders.
The adversary is trying to take one of our points.
We march, Grenadiers. Quit your bitching. Awaiting our Grenadiers. Prepare to advance.
What are your orders?
Grenadiers, back to full strength.
The enemy has claimed our territory for their own.
What needs to be done?
A new unit is reporting for duty. Guns are loaded. Yeah, we're moving there.
What do you need? Awaiting orders, Commandant. Jäger are fully reinforced. Jäger!
They still have 250 points left. We must persevere.
Grenadiers, move those lads.
Pioneer squad stands ready for order.
The adversary is trying to take one of our points.
Being promoted. We're getting out of here.
Infantry! Shoot back, damn it! Retreat!
The enemy is stealing our territory from us.
Get carried! Attacking infantry!
Bastards have secured our territory from us.
I need a medic! You need us? This thing is family, you know? Why can't we have a little cat? Moving! Light infantry ready!
Report, the Allies have only 200 points. The
Commandant,
adversary is trying to take one of our points.
What do you record in that wire down?
Bastards have secured our territory from us.
Fire everything! Down fucking men!
Awaiting orders.
silence!
Ready when you
Grenadiers
clear that
ready.
position. I want to be in that out. Got it?
Weapon crew on standby. Understood. We
Marching
stand
orders.
ready to receive
Commandant, jawohl.
Moving to capture. Keep up.
Halt!
The enemy is stealing our territory from us.
Awaiting your command. What are your orders?
The men are ready.
You have orders? March orders. Max, take the
Territory
lead.
sector lost.
Understood.
Marching orders.
Jäger, I want that infantry taken out, Jäger.
Grenadiers capturing!
Order required.
Capture the location!
Keep up your pace of fire.
The adversary is trying to take one of our points.
We have construction work.
You need us?
That territory will be ours.
Top troops, ready. Boots up, we're going. Grenadiers capturing! Territory secure! Shall we hold?
What are your peg formation? Tactical spacing. Low on ammo. Give us a target.
Jawohl, we're waiting. New unit on the field.
Territory, Commandant.
We're
What now?
eager to get moving. Assault gun, moving. You have orders? Get us moving.
Eyes open for minefields.
Standing by. We're on the move. Follow me.
We are ready, moving to clear wire.
Engines running. Move orders, crew. Cigarettes out, now. The enemy breaks before us. They have only 100 points remaining.
We said I want an orderly advance. Pioneers, move out! I think they expect an answer. Pioneers moving to take location.
Stop! Stop now!
Pioneer squad.
The enemy has 75 points and falling.
Move, Jäger! Don't throw fire! You have orders? Back, damn it!
Fall back! Cover and move!
Full speed!
Have liberated the
Move!
objective.
Fuck the clutch! Move!
Commandant?
The adversary is trying to take one of our points.
We're ready. Let's go, Kinder. We're moving.
Now is the time for action. The enemy has only 50 points left.
Get moving! Schnell!
Give us orders.
Waiting orders. You need us?
Shock troops, confirm location.
The enemy is stealing our territory from us.
Silence! Grenadiers ready!
Guns are loaded.